Welcome to the next in our series of roundtable podcasts from the Centre for Contemporary Art, Derry Londonderry. I'm Catherine Hemmelreich, CCA's director, and I'm delighted to be introducing guests Priya Mistry, Nithya Nagarajan, and Hetain Patel. Priya Mistry is based in the Midlands of England and is a multidisciplinary artist, socially engaged practitioner, and creative producer, straddling dance, performance, visual, and live art. Priya explores possibilities in choreographies between bodies, objects, and space, and frequently partners with institutions to disrupt the status quo. Priya's practice adds discourse to the topics of mental health, neurodiversity, feminist politics, identity, sex and queerness, and climate. And they deconstruct language, exploring sensory, non-word-based vocabularies, exploring possibilities in choreographies between bodies and objects as sculptural propositions, as static and moving arrangements. In 2020, Priya attempted to get to Australia by land and sea, no flights, for a research residency with Critical Path, just as the pandemic erupted. Priya is an associate artist with DAO, Disability Arts Online, In Good Company, Consortium Derby Theatre, quartermaster for the Artistic Mutiny, artist member of Chisenhale Dance Space, Eastside Projects, and Onyx Collective. You can see Priya in Emily Speed's Flatland exhibition and film work at Tate Liverpool until June 2022, and she's working on a new moving image commission with Unlimited for release next year too. Nithya Nagarajan joins us from Australia and is an artist and curator. Her practice adopts movement as a system of inquiry into the sacred, the sensual, and the decolonial. She describes her performance work as affecting sensory perceptions of witness through collaborative process of meaning making underpinned by a strong feminist sensibility. Nithya often invites non-artists as co-performers in participatory projects, such as her dance project, Sacred Grooves for Secular Spaces, as well as interactive projects for children and young people. Nithya's curatorial practice finds her collaborating with artist activists from the subcontinent to present body-based interventions in a range of contexts. She holds an award-winning PhD in performance studies and has had writing appear in publications such as Peril Magazine, Liminal Magazine, and Arts Hub. She is currently working on a chapter for Routledge Reader and a one-woman semi-autobiographical dance theatre work on the coming of age in a culture of abuse. Hetain Patel is based in London and is a visual artist and performance maker, frequently working with artists, family and non-professionals, as well as across disciplines and across languages, culturally and artistically. Hetain's practice has led him to doing Bruce Lee impersonations on stage in the Royal Opera House, undertaking commissions for Tate Modern, making a working class transformer robot out of an old Ford Fiesta with his dad, he points out, and designed part of a mini golf course for the Venice Biennale. Hetain describes himself as interested in connecting marginalized identities with the mainstream in an effort to destabilize notions of authenticity and promote personal freedom. With an autobiographical starting point, he uses humor and the languages of popular culture to highlight familiarity within the exotic, recognition within the unknown. Sometimes this involves exploring fantasy through a DIY domestic lens, whilst other works emulate the high production values of Hollywood. Hetain is a New Wave Associate at Sadler's Wells, London, a patron of Quad Derby and also Film London's Jarman Award, and he sits on the Artists' Council for AN. He is the winner of the Film London Jarman Award 2019, Kino de Kunstfestival's Best International Film 2020, and you can currently see his work in the British Art Show 9, touring throughout 2022. Now, we're here because of you, Priya. Priya, I first met you back in the Midlands in England, where I'm originally from and where I was working at the time, when you were performing as part of Lucy Suggett's Swarm Sculptures. And I knew that I would keep an eye on your practice and hope to work with you in the future. And this podcast came about following your residency with us here at CCA earlier this year. And when we talked about doing this roundtable and potential guests, you rather wonderfully wanted to invite Hetain and Nithya. And I'd love to chat briefly about what it was about their practices that drew you to inviting them.
Yeah, I feel like I should say hi. And yeah, in fact, hello properly, Nithya and Hetain. It's great. Yeah, it's great to see you. Not that it's any less nice seeing Hetain, but it's gorgeous to see you, Nithya. I really miss you.
Likewise.
I wanted to say that. I just needed to say that. I think also that Nithya had left a dark, sort of a deep felt impression on my heart and my person on my visit to Australia and beyond, and the whole time I was there. Yeah, and I deeply miss you. So it's really great to have you in this space. And we had many incredible dialogues, like just chats. We just spoke, and in speaking, we understood that there was, I don't have words for this, but this. So I'm kind of rubbing my hands together, or my fingers together on each hand, and it's I think it's about some kind of substance, something. So I don't know, some sort of connection. I'm sure Nithya will find better words for this to describe it. But yeah, it was like a really heartfelt connection. And my invitation to the both of you is from this position of, wow, lots of things. Like, obviously, we all think about some form of identity and decolonialization in our work. We've been working in different parts of the world, and that speaks very much to also histories of colonizations, those that are not taught and promoted, and how our identities sit, whether we're in the UK, Australia, India, so like somewhere else, and what that shift is, what that does, what happens for us. And I know that we all have that sort of element of international crossover, and that we've all, I know Nithya, you studied here in the UK as well, so we all have like a UK connection and a kind of heritage connection to India. But I think Nithya, you were actually also born there. And with Hetain, what I found interesting is that I think we both kind of studied in the Midlands and came up through the Midlands and a Midlands scene. So we have a lot of people's, places, practices, times in common. It would be very easy, I think, for us to be friends, but actually we've just not been in the same space very much. I think there's just been this observation from a distance going, oh, Hetain's over there, I'm over here, and I think there's been these things going on in our practices that, we've never been in dialogue with. And in the last sort of year and a half or so, during the pandemic and then the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, there have been many dialogues that I've been invited into. And I'm often finding myself as being that token brown or brown type on a panel, and often talking to, a room of white folk, basically. And I really wanted not to do that. And also that whilst I was in Australia, Nithya had started this thing called the Homework Club. It is club, isn't it? Or group?
It's just homework, but close.
Just homework, yeah. And it involved artists who are based in that kind of region and time zone, or sort of Australasia or Asia Austral. And it was the first time in my life that I'd kind of been in a room of practitioners who also have like contemporary resonance, who are all brown. And just that I'd never been more seen in the room. And there was two other Priyas in the room. I think one of the other Priyas said, I've never been more seen. And I was like, yeah, totally. So I guess this invitation is this, want to connect, and this enjoyment of like Hetain's practice from a distance and the humour in your work as well, because just something that I really enjoy. And we're both cross-discipline, but I think perhaps we approach that in quite different ways. And this is just an excuse to be in the room with Nithya and hear her brilliant things that she has to say also. I think I'll stop there, hop back into the room for everyone else.
Well, perhaps picking up on the point of talking cross-discipline, something that threads very much through your practices about is working across disciplines, and not just using any medium, but fully engaging in different canons and discourses and structures of different disciplines. Hetain, perhaps starting with you, what attracts you to working in this way? And maybe an impossible question, but did you have a first passion?
Yeah, I mean, just for kick off, just to sort of pick up a bit on what Priya was saying there, actually. I think, I echo a lot of that really in terms of sentiment and feeling, like I know exactly what you mean in terms of, when we were coming up in the Midlands and we were doing our own thing and cross over and bump into each other occasionally. And I've found that also same in London when I've been since in London, really. There's lots of artists that I follow and admire, but I don't necessarily get to hang out with. And part of me wonders whether it was a bit like we're sort of aware that each other are doing the work, if you like. You sort of hold your post and do the work, and you're sort of grateful that there's some other people out there also doing the work. And it's almost sometimes a bit of a luxury to be able to talk together about it and to connect about it. And probably the similar vein you're saying, Priya, since Black Lives Matter happened, since then, for all of us in different ways, things have just exploded. And the sort of re-traumatizing effect of that definitely had me hankering to connect more with other artists and artists of color. And so I've slowly been doing that. It's hard to do, isn't it? It's, lockdowns, we're all like just busy doing stuff and whatever, but I've definitely been nourished by doing this. And, in a typical fashion, you sort of go, why haven't I done this before? This feels so good. And with this added thing of, since Black Lives Matter happened, in the sort of semi-clumsy way that different art worlds sort of go, yeah, let's give commissions to brown people now. As much as the part of you goes, okay, we'll see what happens next year when it's going to be cool to be green or something, but at the same time, it's also been a joy of seeing your practice and other people's practices out there doing things, and again finding that nourishing. So I was really grateful when you connected to do this chat, and hopefully we can kind of connect more. And so getting back to your question, Catherine, in terms of the multidisciplinary thing, I think probably at the beginning, the reason that I would move from media to medium, it took a long time for me to realize that I like to work in different media, or that I didn't see myself as an artist that worked in a single medium. Like when I was at uni, the things that I graduated with was photography. It was kind of self-portraiture, but still photographs all the time. And then the first time, like the local paper or something put me as part of an exhibition, it mentioned me as a photographer. And I was like, why do they call me a photographer? I'm not a photographer. And, a mate of mine was like, well, you've only ever shown photographs. And I was like, oh, right. So that sort of made me want to just do some video, even though I'd never done video, do some performance, even though I'd never done performance, because I hated the idea of being called a photographer or a filmmaker or a performance artist or whatever. And so initially it was kind of in opposition to being called something, I guess. But now I feel like as artists, in having art practice, you're supposed to, doesn't really amount to this a lot, but you're supposed to have freedom, aren't you? You're supposed to feel free. And it's, this kind of journey towards being free. And sometimes I find myself in it, and a bunch of times I find myself not in it. And the thing about that is, I find, for me personally, if I'm finding myself restricting myself to a single way of engaging or researching or communicating, I don't know why I'm restricting myself. I feel like, when we live in the world, we receive things and engage with things in all different ways, through physical touch, through movement, through visuals, through audio, through the screen. So why wouldn't I communicate that way as well? Receive it this way, so it feels natural or instinctive to communicate in these different ways, if you like. And then secondly, I feel like it also allows me to be able to indulge in different media. So, often something comes from a singular idea, and I'm not necessarily sure if it's meant to be sculpture or performance or film. And so I start trying them in all of these things. And sometimes very quickly, some don't work, and I stay to one thing. Sometimes they all work, and I do them all, but they all end up doing really different things, because there's things that medium can do that others can't, or they work in different contexts. And that gives me the freedom to indulge in that. So, if I'm working in sculpture for an idea, after the idea is developed, I give myself permission to really indulge in the materiality of it, and not think about the other stuff just because I can, that I wouldn't in another medium perhaps. And I just feel like it's different ways to say something. I always sort of think about working cross-disciplinary as having grown up bilingual. And so I think even though it was sort of the bane of my life at the time, it's one of the things that gets you bullied and, anything Indian, that now I feel really grateful for it. I consider it a superpower. It feels like, without realizing it at the time, it feels like it ingrains me with this idea that there isn't just one way to say something, or one way to understand something, or one way to create something. And I feel like that is kind of part of the source bed of my practice in terms of how that manifests in different media. I keep babbling here, but just to answer your final question, if I was to kind of, I don't know if I've got a preferred medium. I think it's probably the body, but I don't know if that's answering the medium, because film a lot and performance a lot, and it does go into, but I think it's still the thing that connects all of them is the body. And I feel like that's still how I most research things, not even necessarily consciously, but I'm aware this is where it's coming from. I guess the journey is trying to have more access to my body. I saw this new film recently from artist Florence Peake, and she's an incredible performer, and I just came away thinking that she just has incredible access to her own body. And I feel like my practice is a bit like that in a way, on a journey to do that. And I feel, all right, I'm gonna shut up.
I was just going to say, I resonate with quite a lot of things there. One thing I wanted to say is that sometimes I feel as though they are like spreading out the brown people. like we can't have them both at the same time. And I feel like a deep desire for there to be more voices and more speakers, and of different generations and ages, so that we can do this as well. And I imagine that if we did this on a panel, that there would also be people in the room not knowing what to do, but having an insight into actually what it's like for us to even be in the room in the first place, So I just kind of wanted to say that. And then also that on the sort of bilingual front, and what you were saying about the body being the main, medium, actually that's really beautiful. I was like, I don't have a main medium, but I think the body is certainly how I access things. And I love Florence's practice as well. I've worked with her, and I keep going back to that relationship of working with Florence. And when you invite her into a space, she just kind of she comes in from the body and moves through the body, and everything is through the body, everything is spoken through the body. But on the cross-discipline front, I think I have resisted from the get-go, like being one thing, which I just felt like nobody understood that. So to some people, I'm a choreographer, and to some people, I'm a body-based visual artist or something like this. And to some people, I'm, a dancer. And then like one day I'm in the clay studio, and another day I'm like working as a dancer for somebody else on a film project, or, whatever it is. But all of those choices they're not kind of just random, they're all to do with like specific sets of interests as well. And I think what I tend to find, other than this entry from the point of the body, is I have an idea, or I have ideas, or ideas evolve, or processes come about, and instead of I'm not like an end product person. I'm very much about process. And it took me a while to be able to assert that, actually, because people are so product orientated. And I think there's such a huge, like for me, the value is in the process, and in the process you can be exploring everything. So for me, the process is the work. And I don't know if Nithya, you find this like with socially engaged practice. For me, socially engaged practice is entirely about the process of being together, and how that works, and what you do, and how you connect. And it's far less about, have we made a thing that looks like a thing that I've made a version of. I never do that in my socially engaged practice. I never present a thing and say we're going to make this. It's never what happens. So I just also wondered how that was for each of you. Maybe Nick.
I just want to first of all reach my arms out and give you a big hug. It has been just so long. I last saw you when we were in a wine bar in my 5K radius. So that is wild to be speaking with you on the other side of the world. And it's really interesting to hear you both speak across so many points of resonances, but also radically different contexts coming from where I'm located. And I think I will start there, that I am on Gadigal lands, and these are lands that some of you might know as Sydney, but I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and give my gratitude to live, work, play, and rest in the protection of the airways and waterways that surround me and the custodians of country who have practiced 65,000 unbroken years of storytelling. So that is the context in which I am located, and sovereignty was never ceded. So the dialogue of being a brown person in Australia in my positionality is also a complicated one, because in the positionality of Australia, I am a settler colonizer. I'm complicit in that process. But then as a minoritized body, I am a product of colonization. So that relationship is really complicated. And when you both are also specifically speaking to Black Lives Matter movement, kind of regenerating an interest in kind of the structural issues and racism in institutional spaces, and that being shifted to a kind of racial capitalism, that conversation is also very different in the context of where I'm dialing in from, where there is a difference between BLAK Black and BLACK Black, and all those positionalities are hyper invisible and marginalized in the artistic landscape here. The arts landscape in Australia still has only 8% cultural diversity, and the metropolitan cities identify as being one of the most multicultural places in the world. So it's a very complicated system to be contending with, and then a complex positionality to occupy within that system as well. So I'm really interested in speaking more and unpacking that. And then with the question on process, I love what you were saying, Hetain, about bilingual and the resistance to the pigeonholing. And Priya, you talking to that from being a young person and always resisting that is so interesting to me, because my training initially is in the dance form of Bharatanatyam, which is a neoclassical dance tradition, and it was entirely in form. And I had a one-track mind for a lot of my life about becoming a Bharatanatyam performer. And I was born in Kuwait, not in India, Priya, but then I moved to India as a teenager and trained and performed and did that whole circuit. And at some point, the code switching between the spaces within the studio space and in real life just didn't fit anymore. And I started to really contend with the caste politics of the form, the appropriation, the kind of disservice the form has to its complicated history, the tethers to diaspora, to its capitalist circulation globally. And that still makes for a love-hate relationship, because I also don't want to deny my body the joy of performance and of knowing it intimately in form. But there did come that fissure point from form, which is what opened me up really to broader disciplines. And I think today I'm much more interested in a line of inquiry, and form is something that comes much later, and form is something that actually serves the question that I'm primarily interested in, or the argument that I'm making, and one that I hope to also come to with empathy and invite people into a collaborative process of unpacking that with me. So you're totally right on the socially engaged process, living in a kind of slow and long and process conscious space that is so about the moment, and there's such an intimacy to it that doesn't always translate and doesn't need to translate to product. Yeah, so I feel like that is kind of how I come to now navigate multiple spaces and then multiple forms within my own making practices. And I'm also interested in South Asian dramaturgical principles, so less about specific form, but about the dramaturgical principles that organically talk about an intrinsic porosity of disciplines, and on learning from First Nations peoples. Here, there are many First Nations languages that do not even have the word artist. The word artist does not exist in language because it is such a way of being. It is just considered part of a way of being, which I think is something we can all learn from.
Yeah, I was thinking this also when Hetain was talking about how some things just don't translate, like it's not possible. It's not only that there is not an equivalent expression, it's that it's it's either like a state of being or it's a cultural context, like it takes account of so many other things that without having lived experience, understood or been enveloped by those things in your life, it's non-translatable. It's only something that comes with experience, and which is also, some of that is also to do with lineage. And it's not even your experience directly lived. It may be that of your parents or your family or or other people. But I think I just wanted to speak to this thing of blackness and having been in Australia and trying to, I think we had quite a few dialogues about what does it mean to be a brown person in Australia, because it was hard for me to travel anywhere due to the pandemic, and that I also had a real query about being some sort of voyeur onto Indigenous peoples, and I was like, I'm coming here from I know nothing, and I need to learn what it means to actually be this body in this space in this time. And I think there is also, just to flip that, to relocate or locate blackness or different types of blackness in different places, that's also, without wanting to state a kind of hierarchy, except historically, perhaps one could say there is a kind of hierarchy in privilege, and on the flip side, in the ways in which people have been colonized and suppressed across time, and to what degree and in what ways. And so often I am sort of observing that I can't speak of Black experience just as much as I can't speak of Hitain's experience, but also I definitely can't speak of Black experience, right? And that where is my position relative to that? And something that I haven't totally explored, but it's like, it's on my mind and it's seeping in, which is about anti-Blackness in brown and Asian societies. And so, yeah, there's that here in Britain, but, there is also that in Australia, just in terms of the lands that we're occupying at the moment. And there's, many more variations on that. Yeah, I'm curious about that. I don't have any answers, but it's a thing that's on my mind. I do know that I think in growing up, that the sense of otherness was always very clear and was very well stated. And that to my parents, I was forthrightly told, you are Indian first and foremost, which is really problematic for me, because what that actually meant is it came with therefore you will, and you are expected to live a life like this and conform to these things. And being of like these sort of first wave of generations that's born here, you having to negotiate your identity as here as being British and then being brown, but actually being Asian. And I do speak about coconutism and various other fruits in my work as well. And I think I've embraced the coconut. Because at some point my parents said to me, you're more white than you are brown, which was like a real insult at the same time, because actually I think I'm one of the more informed people of my generation about what it actually means to come from those cultural precedences and the religious factors, and trying deeply to understand from a really young age the difference between religion and culture and just what humans want and what humans want other humans to do for themselves. But just to come back for a moment to this, there's quite a lot of things there, but like to this otherness is that, so there was always like them and us, them being the white people and then us being the Indian people, which did not include people of Black origin. That people of Black origin were perhaps almost perceived as an even greater threat in certain circles. And this is what I haven't totally understood the whole span of, because there's this deep thing about fitting in and different degrees of fitting in, and that you're allowed to fit in up to a certain extent, but not beyond that as well. And sometimes that means us is like could be an alignment. For example, I'm not saying this is absolutely correct, could be an alignment of brown people and white people, and then the other is the Black, right? You're almost aligned. But now there is a potential for the alignment of brown peoples next to so-called Black peoples. But then there is also this pull of like Black people saying, well, no, because our experience and our lineage, the history and everything that we've come from is very different as well. So I guess I'm just actually throwing quite a few thoughts in the pot that are not fully formulated, but are kind of on my mind. And yeah, it feels like this might be a space where I can put that in and that can be investigated. And I'm not saying that my expression of these points is right. I feel quite uncomfortable about how I've expressed a few things, but it's more from the point of inquiry. And I just wondered if you guys had anything to say on those things as well. It's in the pot.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely relate to a lot of that in terms of how I grew up in Bolton and kind of this idea of them and us, and them being any non-Indian, actually, not just relating to white people and black people, but also Pakistani people or Muslim people, or, you know, anyone outside of the specificity of what's going on in your home life, sort of thing. And it's a really interesting, problematic thing, that, and I guess one of the things that I've observed in my own family in a way is that the only thing that's changed some of that, not all of it, some of it along the way, has been certain people who've had taken partners or married people who are not Indian. And, you know, in my family, the first person to do that was my sister, who married an English guy, and that initially was a really turbulent, very difficult few years. But then when that started to change, and it did change, I think what happened was it started to open up certain people in my family to other kinds of otherness, which I didn't really expect in a way. I thought it might be like, they might just decide, okay, it's all right if you're friends with white people, you know, we've got one of them in the family now, you know. I thought it might be more like that. But actually, for some people, it kind of opened up beyond that. And, you know, not with everyone, don't get me wrong. Yeah, I guess that's I found that unexpected, I guess. I don't know what that sort of says, but I think part of it was also growing up. It was a bit like movement was really insular. You know, the only people we see is people in our family. You know, weekends forced to do family visits, and it's only us as the British-born generation who, you know, go to school and mix with the white kids, sort of thing. And that insularism is one of the things that really keeps in this mode of them and us and otherness somehow. And there's something about, you know, for all of the horrors of modern and digital life now, I think that's been some, you know, it's got its big problems, don't get me wrong, but some movement in my family that's kind of opened things up, you know, taking the edge away from some of that sort of thing that you grow up in and internalize. I think that's the thing that was difficult, that I felt like part of my journey, my practice and my life feel like had to be a sort of an ongoing undoing of, which is ongoing actually, you know, an undoing of internalizing that stuff that's kind of comes from that generation of anyone outside of, you know, what you're supposedly told you are is bad or different or whatever. And I consider that a practice somehow. And, you know, it's really interesting to hear you both talk about process actually in terms of your works. And I kind of feel like, even though I do create a lot of product working with my family, I think a lot of it is really connected to the process of those works. And in those process, for me at least, it feels like I can't do it in my day-to-day life as much, but through my work somehow, I feel like some of my political agendas in my work can happen a bit more through engaging my family through my practice somehow, because it creates this space where more things are allowable, and not just from me as a practitioner, but also from my family members. You know, if it's in a conversation over a cup of tea, the usual restrictions are there. But if it's we're playing with this project, having a bit of fun with it, or whatever, it feels like things become a bit more allowable, and not just in a practical way, but in a emotionally, maybe politically, maybe. And I wonder whether that's also something about you both being so engaged in practice. I mean, do you find that sort of process allows an opening in a way that not working towards a product does? Is that a weird way to say it?
Yeah, for sure. Because I think also in a beginner's mind, there's just possibilities. Whereas I think when you're in a form that kind of closes down the boundaries of what remains possible. And Priya, I'm really interested in your questions, because I feel often like it's not my space to speak in these conversations. But since you were so vulnerable, I feel compelled to share that I moved here as an adult. So I guess I moved here with a relative self-actualization that had already taken place. And so I don't feel like I grew up in a relationality to whiteness that has the them and us, because I didn't grow up in a country that was predominantly white. So my sense of self has always been relational to brownness and growing up in India. And so I think that makes a really big difference in even the spaces that you believe you can take up. And I see it a lot in being able to take up space. But having said that, I think the question you ask with South Asian communities, anti-Blackness, and that is a huge issue, you know, in most parts of the world, really, whether that is the subcontinent or overseas, and that it's impossible to have that conversation without thinking of the history and implications of caste. And I think that's a really hard conversation to have in the diaspora, because so much of the diaspora, certainly in many parts of the world, certainly in Australia, are caste forward. So it becomes a really difficult conversation to have around colorism or anti-Blackness in a caste forward environment. And when I moved here, I really thought it was a diaspora politic, and I could not get myself to engage for a long time, because it didn't come from a alliance building or solidarity building perspective. But in the same vein, now having been here, and you were talking to Homework, having connected to diaspora artists, and having been here for nearly a decade, I also see what the process of uprooting your life and moving does in tightening your grip around to that insularity that you were talking about, Hetain, what it does to tightening your grip around notions of tradition or culture. So that tension feels very alive in those spaces. And then in terms of like not diversity or inclusion, but actually equitable practices, certainly in the context of Australia, I see it as First Nations first, really, and then going backward from that. So rather than alliance building by the indicators of funding, which put you in culturally and linguistically diverse in Australia, which is just one huge bracket of everybody that does not identify as white, it's really looking at action through the spaces of First Nations people, then people who were displaced or came here on refugee status, then migration of people who came here by choice migration, who are generationally further ahead, so like children of migrants, second, third generation, and then people who came in on a class migration. I think that gives a framework for building more equitable practices that aren't dictated by the mandates of funding bodies or how we're asked to classify or speak about our practices. Yeah, I don't know if that feels like they're also just open-ended thoughts, Priya, but I don't know how that resonates or for you, Hetain.
It's really interesting, this idea of talking about it in terms of equitable practice. In terms of, kind of the ordering that you just said there, and in some ways, adds a little bit of clarity to the kind of mess in my head, or kind of overwhelm, I guess, with thinking of some of that.
Well, otherwise it's racial capitalism, really, and then we become co-opted by the institution continuously, and we're all implicated in different ways in that, but it just shifts that on its head.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation to keep having, but also with many other voices and actually learning, if I'm honest. But thank you for speaking to that, because I felt, vulnerable putting it on the table, but, also being in a sort of exclusively brown round table conversation means that I can put it on the table as well, if that makes sense. And that it's important to do, because if it's not spoken about, it continues to sort of be invisible and not spoken about and not understood. And it's also something that I'm continuously, with white folk around me, I'm continuously going, this work, this anti-racism work, that is my work to do as well. I'm continually pointing that out, that I have to do that work too, and that I don't have all the answers. And I think that's something that's really valuable about being in this room at the moment with both of you right now, because also I think there is this thing of, one needs to work harder, and if you're invited in as the brown element,
which also means the diversity expert element, right?
Yeah, and also like the least responsible for solving the problem, you know, for dealing with it, which is a kind of flip to do with that whole thing of, you know, people dealing with their white supremacy, but that there is also work to do here as well, like absolutely fundamental work as well. And I think there's a few things about what Nithya was starting to speak about, both of you speak about, but I'm just wondering about one's role as an artist. And you know, I was thinking about that the other day, because there's many things that have kind of come into play. One, that from an early stage, I didn't just want, you know, I was really not attracted to wanting to make work about myself, about my identity, because I felt immediately pigeonholed by that. But actually also that my first most authentic work was from a place of my own experience and to do with identity. And so it continues to reoccur as well. But there's also something about, over time, understanding the importance and the power of that. But another thing that I find problematic as well, other than people needing to, you know, noting that we need to do the work, or brown folk need to do the work, is also that actually most of my work is met with by white folk. And my dream is like for it to be met with by brown folk, at least from the background of my diaspora, because I found that to be really problematic, in that initially I was perhaps trying to get away from a space that was full of those peoples because I didn't feel understood there, and then moving into spaces that were full of white people, which allowed me to be something else. So there is this thing about the potential of things, but also the potential of being something other than that which people are telling you you are or you need to be as well. And I think maybe that also speaks to this thing of form and cross-discipline as well, and resistance towards being one form, because I think through my life, I think I'm also kind of doing some sort of shape-shifting internally, and to do with my body and my relationship to my body and then my body's positioning in spaces and in the world. I just wonder, yeah, for me, there's lots of things at play, because you sort of can't escape all the cultural information comes in, right? And I think what's useful about the cultural information that's coming from my diaspora is that you're kind of doing culture all the time. And when you've come to this country and you're surrounded by whiteness, but then you're in a city, I grew up in Leicester, which is like the mini India. It's the first city in Europe where the so-called ethnic population is the majority. You know, that whole thing of the biggest Diwali celebrations outside of India are in this place called Leicester, you know, and so on and so forth. And everyone comes to get their wedding stuff in Leicester if they can't do a trip to India. You know, it's the next economically viable situation. I know I'm talking very neurodiversely right now in all the directions. But I think on the one hand, the very many celebrations, the very many rituals, the very many punctuations in your life and in your calendar as a person from the diaspora that I've come from means that you are actively going and required to perform your culture, basically. And why it feels so distinct is because you don't go and perform your culture at school. You go to a mandir, like a temple, and you go and perform your culture there, or you go to a tent that the community has acquired, or a building or a park, and you go and actively perform your culture there, and they're in your diary. Also, I don't know if you had this Hetain, and I don't know how it would have translated for you, Nithya, but like there was always a calendar at home, and there still will be, of like, you know, it's the Indian calendar. So you might have the dates in the UK, that's one thing, but actually we have like the Indian calendar, which is relative to the moon and the cycles and what's happening, and that calendar has also resonance with actually the moons and the situations partially in India, until they did that a little bit and got their own versions, you know. So you're already operating like on a different type of calendar, culturally, racially, not just to do with the elements and the moon. It's not only like a pagan concept, if you like. You know, you're existing on different cultural planes at the same time, and you go to different places to perform different things here. That's what you do. So you're very conscious of that. Your outfits would change. And, you know, there are people at school and people in my life who've, you know, they've never seen me in a sari. They just don't know what that looks like. They've never seen me in that form. So it would be a real surprise to them to see that. And other people have more of this going on nowadays. I say nowadays, but there is a conscious performing of things, and it involves song and dance and food and long periods of like cooking and going to people's houses and doing certain greetings, so and all of that. And so for me it's like, well, I'm always performing. And I think this thing of being bilingual as well is like, I have realized that I've grown with an incredible degree of empathy. Like, I'm very empathetic and I'm very able to read others, and I've become very expert in sort of mirroring others and allowing them to feel understood, allowing them to think or feel that I am one of them as well, which I think is a very deeply ingrained hardcore skill, not just only code switching through language, but code switching through what you're wearing or your posture or the spaces you inhabit, what you say, what you don't say, and what things you do or don't perform, and how you explain your absence from something or your engagement with something. And at the same time, trying to avoid being simply exoticized and othered when you are asked about your background. But yeah, I think that is just a response to many things that you were saying. And also that I think I too have been using my practice as a way to work through lots of things. It's interesting, it's a role. And from the position of that role, you can kind of do certain things that you can't just do, or I can't just do as Priya or as the daughter of because that's how you're viewed otherwise, right? So yeah, from the position of an artist, it's like you can make certain inquiries. And I think actually, Hetain, I remember this point really early on where I think my first sort of work that I would very sincerely regard as being probably my first proper bit of work was called In the Same Frame. And it was a series.
I remember it, you know, really distinctly. It's one of the searing works in my mind of your work, actually. You know, I remember when I first saw it, I tell people about it. I still tell people about it. It really spoke to me really deeply, and I'd never seen anything like it. You know, I'd never seen. I won't try and. I mean, I'm very happy to, but I think you were about to say about the work, weren't you? You're saying about the photography series, right?
Yeah, and actually, go for it.
I mean, you know, from my memory of what I remember, it was a photographic series of you and your dad with your boyfriend at the time in the background somewhere, without your dad not only having never met him before, or not even know about him before. So like, I don't know if it was this way or I remembered it this way, but stuff like outdoors in a park, you know, you and your dad, and like your boyfriend was just in the background sort of thing, and there was a series of them, and it just did loads of stuff. You know, it was so simple and yet so heavy and laden with tension, and not dramatic tension in the kind of creating something to try to put drama or tension like a film might, but in lived history, in something that was very current. And I think it really spoke to this not knowingness or trying to figure outness of how to be with an older generation, you know, in this going against reference, or also trying to be respectful or not, or trying to hold on to, trying to have a relationship, but wondering how, and trying something, and the ongoing liveness of that, and the instability of that somehow. I don't know what year was that series, Priya?
I think it was, I want to say 2002.
Yeah.
I was still at university, and it's probably worth saying that my boyfriend at the time was white.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
And that in that shoot, my dad didn't know that he was there, so he still hadn't met him. It was a series of Polaroids, so the form was quite deliberate. I must admit, in process, I shot on Polaroid and I shot on SLR at the time, but I realised the value of the Polaroid was that it was, you know, you had to work harder to get both people in the frame at the same time without my dad knowing that my boyfriend at that time was in the background. And what went on is it was kind of shot across a day. We just like mobile phones had just become like everyone had got them like as we were going to uni, right? And so I was getting these messages from my boyfriend saying, I think he's clocked, you know. And so what would happen, I was like, he has no idea. Which is, so what would happen is that my boyfriend was like moving further away, and it was harder for me to get a shot where you could clearly see both of them. So I had to like sort of had to move closer to my dad. And so my dad's face was kind of like getting bigger and taking up more of the frame. And my boyfriend was like getting smaller and was kind of further away. Yeah. And he was actually, you know, he was really worried. I remember before I did it that a friend of mine had said, are you sure about this? Because this could go really badly for you. And I just had to not think and do it. And the place from which that occurred was, or that what ended up being a piece of work came about, was I wasn't trying to make work. I was actually really angry and upset. And I'd had a conversation with my dad, which was like super coded, where we didn't say anything really straight up in a way. And, you know, I'd been seeing this person, I was in love with them. I didn't say any of that to my dad, but there was this sort of, you know, reading of something, possibly disobedience, where my dad always had conversations in the car. This seems to be a continuous thing, but that's another conversation, where he was basically saying, in a way, you might be doing whatever you're doing right now, and possibly with whoever. I don't know that he imagined that far, but like at the end of the day, you'll marry like a nice Indian boy, you know. And that absolutely just, it was like, you know, it was like 21 or something, 21, 22. And I just, you know, has spent my whole life trying to sort of, in a way, prepare them for not expecting me to follow the expected route. And at the same time trying, it's interesting to hear you describe it, because it's also like trying to desperately hold on to not losing your parents, because that is kind of like the ultimatum that was met certainly through a lot of our generations if people did partner with or marry people outside of the diaspora. So I guess all of that tension is there as well. And I remember thinking at the time, what is the point in trying to become, you know, becoming an artist or whatever, if I can't even do what I want in life as a person? So yeah, I was just really mad, and I didn't intend it as a work. I don't know, I just kind of had to do it. But I'm very lucky in a way to have yourself having seen it at that time, because as I said, most of my work has been met with like a white audience, and when it's met with a white audience, it's very othered. It's someone else's experience, and like, whoa, is your dad really strict? And it's just like, it's not point.
It's an interesting thing, that, isn't it? Like, I think both what you just said then, Priya, and talking about, you saying earlier as well about a response from the predominant white audience to your work, your practice, to you. I feel like this is something that maybe for the three of us, I don't know why we're interested in the body also, certainly from a diasporic place. It's like you get a sense from very young that you're being judged and interacted with and whatever due to reasons that you don't realize at first. You know, how you look, how you talk, how you dress, how you smell, kind of what you're eating, how you eat it. And then you sort of, I felt like I had to sort of grow into this realization of, oh, right, I'm not a neutral body. It's like, okay, I'm not neutral here. And so in my practice, I feel like both the challenge, the thing that I enjoy, and the thing that also feels like a burden is that before you do anything, that you have to respond to that you have to kind of navigate this idea of neutrality and not being neutral. And then, you know, those questions that you're talking about, Priya, in terms of who sees that work, of who we're making it for, and what's the purpose of it. I'm gonna, sorry, just blurt in probably a non-linear way as well, you know, just because lots of things that you sort of spoke to, what you said, were also about how it's met. But then, do we change then how we make work, you know, with the idea of communicating to a different audience? Or do we go, no, and this is the work, and we try to change the audience? You know, like you said, is it possible to locate your work within a diasporic audience? Do you just do that? Or is it somewhere in between? I feel like I go between, I don't know if between's the right word, but move across that sort of sphere in terms of thinking of those things, and all of it boils down. And then you sort of come in at that, comes with this desire to connect and to understand what you talk about, Priya, in terms of empathy, and that which comes, I think, from trying to fit in and trying to figure that out in a way has the least trauma or has the least violent part. So trying to fit in to avoid violence, or trying to fit in to avoid trauma. And I feel like some of that journey is where empathy comes from somehow. You know, you do it as a defense mechanism, but then part of that becomes something else somewhere along the way. Sorry, I'm going off on a real track here. It's kind of just lots of things he said. So feel free, anyone to jump in, Nithya, or
I'm just sucking you into my new universe.
Excellent. Well, there's just so much to talk about, isn't there? You know, it's just so complex, and I think, you know, again, something you were saying earlier, but I think what happens is when there's the three of us in the space, is that because we don't get put into being the one representative of a certain ethnicity or whatever, it allows you to be freer in the complexity of how we are, how we feel, how we make, how we be. And, you know, I think that's really useful in a way, to be able to do that, because that feels like what you don't get to do so much.
That was so interesting to listen to you, Hetain, like speak about Priya's work that you encountered all those years ago, and then have you both talk to the light and shade of it. And I have so many questions. I want to know how willing your collaborators are when they're your family, and how you're negotiating and renegotiating that relationship, but also the question of audiences, when that comes into your process. Is that something that you think about during your process, or have started to consider more during your process? And it's interesting that you say, Priya, you feel like your work is mostly consumed in white spaces, and where you should meet your audience, the question you posited, Hetain, on where you should meet your audience or where they come to you. And I will talk to that through the example of the work I'm making right now, because it's not something I've considered as intently as I'm considering at this moment. And because that it is a semi-autobiographical one-woman work of living through an abusive relationship. And I should posit a trigger warning here for listeners. And it is really deals with kind of coming of age in a culture of abuse as a teenager, and going through an experience of intimate partner violence for 4 years. And initially, I'd invited other artists into the process and wanted to have the anchor of it being semi-autobiographical to loosen the process from needing to be close to the narrative alone. And we were thinking of making a sonic installation in a space that really through a register of memoir and reportage and then oral sounds goes through this, walks the audience through a very affective and sensory experience. But then it really mattered to me that the people in diaspora experience this work, because while gender violence is universal, its mechanisms of how it unfolds can be very culturally located, and this was a culturally specific unpacking. And it became really important to me that it is told at a scale where the community will come to see it and really engage with it. And it really shifted the form of the work and the way the work will encounter the audience, and even the presenting partners and the community engagement piece of the work. And it's got me thinking about how much earlier I've considered it with this work than usually in my process. And I'm really interested in both your processes and where you think that relationship, particularly after 2 years of kind of being in isolation as well, and making, where that consideration comes into your process.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. So I think, as I was hearing you speak, I think there's been a deep desire for that, but then I've also not felt particularly supported as an artist to marry that desire for audience. And I actually spoke very upfrontly about that to an organisation who I won't mention right now. And I was met with sort of two very different responses by the two people from the organisation. One was a very listening stance, and I'm hearing you. And the other was, good luck with that. And I was just really appalled. And that certainly in the UK, there is this, the onus seems to be on the artist to bring in a particular type of audience. So there's that factor. And there is actually a huge vulnerability, especially I think somewhere in my work, I often feel like I'm actually being quite critical about the community and the culture, but what I'm really being critical of is the difficulty of of that experience as well, you know, and who the what that community is also then changed over time. So things like marriage across, you know, between brown folk and white folk or different backgrounds is perhaps viewed differently nowadays because we're dealing with different generations. And also in plainness, certain generations have died, and that is literally what is making difference, because the grip of generational impact is a really long arm. So I think, if I'm honest, I feel really vulnerable in that sense. But then in my creative producing practice, I think I've started to do a very different thing, and that is to invite in other voices and artists or peoples from certainly brown backgrounds and support them to present and to try and bring in those audiences. So doing that work that nobody is doing for me, essentially. And one of the events was I invited Chanda Vyas, who is the first female Hindu priest in the UK. And this is actually quite a hard thing to negotiate, also to do with things that she did and didn't want to talk about. And she's not used to speaking in this way either. So I had to go to her house and have like chai and gathia, which for a non-Indian speaking audience is tea and Indian snacks, you know. And it took a lot of dialogue to make her feel safe and bring her in and ask her to be there. And it was my job to do that, and also try to bring this mix of audiences into the room as well, and find the context for like longer reaching arms and people who got access to marketing folk to get other people in, but also like the actual outreach work. You know, most outreach is a long journey, and that takes a lot of time. So yeah, I think I started to sort of try to form those spaces for others and get those audiences in. I'm repeatedly having dialogues with organizations every time I'm working with an organization to ask, who are you attempting to engage in the work that I'm doing, and how and when, and how, and to understand that relationship, and also to say who I think the audience should be and who I'm interested in meeting with, and what I think would be interesting for the work. And the work is essentially, in that moment, the work is a dialogue. And because often what happens is, it certainly happened within the same frame and has happened with other works since then, is that there is kind of, the work is almost like a provocation when it's to do with identity. That's what I tend to seem to present. And then the work isn't finished once that is presented. It then begins the work of dialogue. So I've always now had to fit in time after presenting a work that is then just time for dialogue and questions. And it's not like a Q&A. It is like literally a dialogue that is coming up, and all the questions that it's bringing up from the work, and conversations that people literally want to have. And because I've created the provocation, they want to have it with me, you know. So then I have to make space for that. So yeah, I think in answer to your question, Nithya, it's like there's something about sort of capacity and power and expectation. And yeah, when I'm doing socially engaged work or work which is creative producing, I deeply go in there. And it's really hard to have my own practice dealing with all the things I'm dealing with, and then taking it wherever I'm taking it, you know, to then find the audience. And then I guess it would be very different to be much more situated somewhere and to be building that relationship, which is another thing that I'm thinking about. So I am sort of building more longer relationships with organizations and places that I work with. I don't really do touring. You know, a few years ago, I just sort of said I don't do touring because it's just going in somewhere and then going back out, and I'm not interested in doing that. So yeah, I think that's perhaps me pitching in. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Hetain?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Nithya and Priya for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear you both talk. It's both like taking in your experiences, and then it also, I guess, naturally you find yourself locating yourself, or trying to, or kind of thinking, yeah, no, I don't know, you know. And I think one of the things that I've found over this time is I feel like I'm at the early stages of some of what you just spoke about there, Priya, in terms of I think one thing that's changed for me over this time, and probably since Black Lives Matter happened, was you know, a lot of my practice has been not built on, but has as one of its primary modes kind of a humor to those sort of things that I'm dealing with. And one of the reasons is it is kind of what I'm like, but also it is all I do. I guess one of the reasons I like it is because it's almost, I find it a connective tool to connect some of the stuff that we talk about in our practice with an audience who might not be from that. And it feels like as a way to kind of connect with people rather than allow them the possibility to put up a wall and to go, that's interesting, but it's something else that isn't to do with me. And so the humor is partly to do that. And then over this past year, I found myself, which I'm still doing in the early stages of really, or only the last year or so, is finding a place for a different mode in my work, that of anger, and really indulging in anger. And not quite in the kind of no more Mr. Nice Asian kind of way, but, you know, kind of like an acceptance that that's just part of the whole wider thing, you know. And so some of the more recent works that I've shown that are to do with that, some paintings that I've made, was I found I wasn't really able to kind of take it in and express it at the time, but I guess I feel more like it as it was happening and learning about it, of how people responded to that. And, you know, in a way, people have not yet quite know how to respond to it. So it's like, I found people responded to it quite clumsily, or when I say people, you know, the contemporary art world, which is obviously white middle class in the UK at least. So what I find myself doing, which I guess maybe we always do, which we shouldn't always do, it's not always our job, is to try to find the solution to that, and sort of go, how can I not make it more palatable, but how can I, because I'm not going to change the work, but how can I have this occupy space and it's still to connect and to be accepted as part of this mix of what my practice is. And that, you know, Priya spoke earlier about this idea of not thinking of it as a work at first, but she was just angry. And you know, I feel like now in my practice, I think if there's one thing that I do feel more comfortable with, is just bringing anything I want into my work, you know, almost considering it all work. It's all work, isn't it? You know, whether we call it that or not. And just kind of trying to be responsive to letting that in, and just trying not to edit it out or to censor myself, I guess. And so I'm definitely in this period where some of those works that are angry at because they need to be, I'm trying to find a place for them to be shown and engaged with without a more clumsy sense of white guilt. You know, to get it sounds a bit abstract, so to give you an example, you know, I've been making a series of set of paintings, and some of them are versions of family portraits, and some of them are text works, and the text works are sort of a screenplay version of a traumatic event from my family history. And so when you see the exhibition, you see these family portraits of sorts, and they look quite different to photographs. They're very different photographs, but they're family portraits. And the thing that transforms what those family portraits are is the text, the paintings that are the text. And so I found myself recently where there was a UK collection that bought one of the works, but they just bought the family picture. You know, what they didn't buy is the text work, which transforms what that family picture is. And so, you know, at the time, felt so fresh. You know, I was doing lots of other projects, and it kind of, you know, got caught up in the momentum of it. But I think what I'm actually going to do now is to try to have a conversation with that institution about that, and to just find a way for that text to stay with that work, if you like, because it felt like that the museum was acquiring it with, you know, I could tell in the other artists that they work, you know, that they want to change what the works are acquiring, by who, and who's represented with this idea of family in their works. And, you know, so like in a lot of these ways, it's coming from a good place. However, rethinking about it, it felt like a bit of a deletion as well. You know, you can't have the family picture without the trauma, you know, that I've created it with. So, you know, I guess I'm learning about my making of these works that are in a different mode to what I would usually make, and trying to figure out for an audience and for myself what feels like the right way that I can feel good about. Yeah, I think so.
I think it's great that you're finding a way for the text to be able to live with the companion piece, so the original intention of the work remains.
Yeah, I think with this sort of clearing this position of I'm not touring actually comes with lots of other things. So it's interesting when you perform work, because even if I'm presenting something visual or something else, like my body is normally there. I am normally a provocation in myself, but I'm also presenting a provocation. So, and I think it's interesting, no more Asian Mr. Nice Guy, which is very, I think I've never fully occupied the nice Asian space. And I was listening to someone describe, what's her name? Josephine Baker, as performing her sort of work and her performance being this, how do they describe it? The emancipatory potential of being problematic. I'll say that again. Her work being the emancipatory potential of being problematic. And when I heard that, I went, yeah, that's what I do. Also, I think in my work, I present problems and not answers. And I sit in discomfort, and I sit in risk, and I sit in vulnerability, and I stand willing to change my mind, but also not to have the answers, you know. And I think, yeah, that's where it stops just being my job. It's like, you know, this is where you're meeting, the artist meets whoever is meeting with the work. You know, this is like, well, this is your work. I brought the problem, I brought the provocation, and I brought the questions. And now you are meeting with it, and the question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? You know, and I'm not here to give those answers. And even when I'm invited on panels and things, I'm also not there to provide the answers. My position is normally of, that's not good enough, or there are all these alternative systems, why don't you just go and engage them? You know, do the work, don't talk the work. You know, and also to do with the panels, I took a position where I decided that I would ask what they're actually doing about the issue that they're discussing. And if there's actually no action that comes with the discussion, I'm not doing the discussion. You know, so I'm aware of what my position is in those things, and I will only work with organizations or spaces or peoples or groups that are also, we're up for that, and we're up for the learning. And the learning is not just theirs, the learning is mine. Like, I'm constantly learning as well. And I think with a work like Tropical Awkward Bastard, I have autobiographical material in there, but I also have alternative histories in there as well. And I use the format of cabaret because I can work with materials and objects that are signifiers and hold information, and I can play with that, and I can play with the position of ideas of entertainment and exoticization, but also in a form that is at its ground. Like, cabaret is actually very much about political commentary in its origins, you know. To be able to bring an audience in quite lightly, playfully, not knowing why, using humour, and then go heavy. And that is the journey that we go on. We go light, we go heavy, we go light, we go heavy. And I have to sort of release sort of any responsibility for how awkward a potential white audience or any other audience feel. You're there to sit in that. If that's not what you're sitting in, then I'm not doing my job, basically. But what I'm interested in is what you're going to do beyond sitting in it just over there. And that I'm not here to do this to kind of smooth the edges at the end and make everything all right, because everything is not all right. And I just, because I'm also aware of time on our podcast, just to speak to this thing of other forms and other works that are also not around biography and personal experience, because that is the thing. If you're making work of that ilk, there is then becomes this sort of, if you like, in market terms, a sort of demand for it, you know. And actually, I'm very careful not only to do that, because it's not my only line of interest or inquiry, but there's a heavy alignment there to do with my ethics and people and community and outreach and all those really core things that are part of my practice, that are about people meeting with people and me getting to meet with people. But in works where it's body led, or it's more sculptural, or it's more materials based, there's also a potential for me and my body to meet with other materials and other situations and other structures and other architectures, which also actually, as a brown person, as a brown body, people are also not used to seeing that, you know. They're not used to seeing, I don't know, a brown body wrapped in sheets of massive blue paper or whatever. Or when I was at the CCA last year in Derry, that's one of the examples of me situating my body in those places. And I'm not primarily thinking of myself in terms of my diaspora, but I'm aware that it's still there, you know. And I do think in colours and shapes and textures, as well as in movement. So I think, there is more to my practice and my body and ideas of movement that work across different planes. And what I'm sort of wondering is, like, you know, what's going on? Are people like looking and making two different sets of readings? That's Priya in decolonization mode over there. Let's read it in that term, and then that is Priya in like visual art mode. And therefore, in that space, is the language only then about visual art mode and sculptures and shapes and able and non-able bodies, because I also deal with those notions as well. So, you know, there's like a categorization switch, and it comes back to that thing of being cross-discipline, and people seemingly, certainly in the UK, needing you to be one discipline or another to form some sort of understanding. And what I find problematic about that as well is, on a sort of socially engaged level, on a cultural level, is that there then becomes like, there are these bodies of practice that are happening in the arts, and then there's like public and community stuff, and there is a massive dissonance between the two, apparently. And I think that is created by ideas of institutions and industry, and I don't think that the art industry is particularly a working model of industry or industrialization. You know, it's like, yeah, I get this a lot in the dance scene. So I hear about, I find myself sitting in conversations in different art form scenes. Sometimes I'm like, these guys are really behind, because in that scene they had this conversation, like, you know, a few years ago. And the place in which I feel that the conversations are most far ahead and nobody's caught up is in the disability sector, whether that's from a position of activism or disability arts. And also it's a space in which people are, you know, have been making demands and continue to make demands. And I think it's where I learn to also articulate this kind of language that is about saying, this is not enough, and I'm making a demand. And I say that because, you know, during this pandemic, I've also been in a room where I'm in a room and it's other practitioners of like brown diaspora who work in, let's say, a theatre context, and they are just sort of going, oh, well, it would be nice if like once a year there was a residency that was just for someone from a brown diaspora. And I'm like, you know, WTF? Like, what the like, that is beyond me. I'm really like, no, there should be a 90% flip of your program or whatever. Like, I'd make a demand that it seems to be outrageous to you. It's not outrageous, you know? So yeah, anyway, I guess I'm again speaking from my many neurodiverse places, but I guess in one essence I'm saying, you know, I'm everything contained and outside and around this body in the context of this body, but I'm also lots of other things and lots of other potentials. And by putting my body in those situations and negotiating those architectures, those materials, those colors, those planes, and what my body can and can't do as my body changes and as I get older, there's so many different dialogues going on for me internally, and there's so many things that I present and share. So yeah, just loads going on there about everything. Don't know. Probably not helping to bring this conversation to some podcasty end at all, but yeah.
I think it feels really perfect to finish with a really expansive, open-ended, just there's so much to pick up on. I'm absolutely gutted that we have come to the end of our time today, but I just want to thank you all so much for your time, for your thoughts, for your vulnerabilities, and really sharing. It's been an absolute privilege to be able to sit here and listen, and I hope we can keep in touch, and thank you all. And finally, thank you again to our guests, Priya Mistry, Nithya Nagarajan, and Hetain Patel. You can listen to more of our roundtable podcasts by visiting ccadld.org and also subscribing to our podcast on Spotify, iTunes, and other podcast providers. This roundtable is made possible thanks to the support of Arts Council of Northern Ireland, Derry City and Strabane District Council, and the Art Fund. And thank you for listening.